What happens when a late-night talk show host pushes too hard and a royal rebel pushes back even harder? You won't believe what unfolds when Stephen Colbert's trademark wit meets Meghan Markle's fierce determination in what becomes the most explosive television moment of the year. Tonight's episode of The Late Show promised to be just another celebrity interview. But what viewers witnessed was a masterclass in how quickly things can spiral completely out of control when two strong personalities clash over some of the most controversial topics in modern media. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when the gloves come off and the real conversation begins. The tension was palpable from the moment Meghan Markle walked onto the Ed Sullivan Theater stage. Something felt different about this appearance compared to her usual carefully orchestrated media rounds. She carried herself with an almost defiant energy, her shoulders squared and her expression steely as she settled into the guest chair across from Stephen Colbert. The audience, sensing something unusual in the air, offered polite but somewhat muted applause. Colbert, ever the consummate professional, began with his standard warm welcome, but there was a glint in his eye that suggested he had come prepared for more than just promotional pleasantries. "Meghan, welcome back to The Late Show. It's been quite a journey since we last spoke, hasn't it?" His tone was friendly enough, but those familiar with Colbert's interviewing style could detect the subtle edge beneath the surface charm. Markle's response was immediate and pointed. "Stephen, it's always interesting coming on shows like this because you never quite know what version of yourself the host is going to present to their audience." She leaned forward slightly, her hands clasped in her lap, but her posture suggesting she was ready for whatever was coming. "I've learned to be very careful about how my words can be twisted or taken out of context." The first warning shot had been fired, and Colbert didn't miss it. His eyebrows raised slightly, and that familiar smirk began to play at the corners of his mouth. "Well, that's fascinating because I was actually going to ask you about context. Specifically, the context around some of your recent statements about media responsibility and the role of late-night television in shaping public opinion." He shuffled his note cards deliberately, a theatrical gesture that everyone in the room understood meant he was about to dig deeper. Markle's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "I think what I said was that certain media figures have a responsibility to use their platforms thoughtfully, especially when discussing issues that affect real people's lives and safety." Her voice remained measured, but there was steel beneath the silk. Some hosts seem to think that humor gives them a free pass to perpetuate harmful narratives. The audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. This wasn't the typical celebrity banter they'd expected. Colbert, however, seemed energized by the challenge. "That's interesting because I seem to remember you making some pretty specific comments about late-night hosts who, and I'm quoting here, hide behind comedy to avoid accountability for the damage they cause. Were you referring to anyone in particular?" The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Markle's jaw tightened, and for a moment, the only sound in the theater was the gentle hum of the air conditioning system. When she finally spoke, her voice had dropped to a more dangerous register. "I think viewers are smart enough to recognize when someone is asking that question because they already know the answer." Colbert leaned back in his chair, clearly enjoying himself now. "Oh, I love that. So mysterious. But since we're talking about accountability, let's talk about some of your recent business ventures. The podcast deal that fell through, the Netflix projects that seem to be struggling to find their footing. Some critics are saying that maybe the problem isn't with the media coverage, but with the execution." His delivery was smooth, but the words cut deep. The color rose in Markle's cheeks, and her composed facade began to show the first cracks. "That's exactly what I'm talking about, Stephen. You're taking complex business situations that involve multiple parties and reducing them to sound bites that fit your narrative." She gestured emphatically, her media training warring with her obvious frustration. "You know that's not how these industries work, but it makes for better television to oversimplify everything. But surely you understand that when you put yourself in the public eye, especially when you're constantly talking about your struggles with the media, people are going to examine your track record," Colbert countered, his tone becoming more pointed. "I mean, you've made media criticism a central part of your brand. Don't you think that opens you up to some scrutiny about your own relationship with publicity?" Markle's hands clenched in her lap, and when she looked up at Colbert, there was fire in her eyes. My relationship with publicity? That's rich coming from someone who built his entire career on a character that mocked political figures and then seamlessly transitioned into becoming part of the very establishment he used to satirize. The words came out sharp and fast, like bullets from a machine gun. At least I'm honest about my evolution. The audience gasped audibly. This had gone from interview to interrogation to something approaching warfare. Colbert's smile faltered for just a moment before returning, but now it had a sharper edge. Wow, okay. So we're doing this then. He set down his note cards and leaned forward, matching her intensity. Let's talk about honesty. Because I've got to say, for someone who talks a lot about authenticity and truth-telling, you seem to have a pretty flexible relationship with both when it serves your purposes. The battle lines were now clearly drawn, and both combatants seemed to realize there was no going back. Markle's voice rose slightly, her careful media training beginning to crack under the pressure. What exactly are you implying, Stephen? Because if you have something to say, maybe you should just say it instead of hiding behind your little jokes and your audience's laughter. Colbert's eyes gleamed with the thrill of the chase. Oh, I'm not hiding behind anything. I'm wondering about someone who claims to want privacy but can't seem to stop talking to the media. Someone who says they want to be left alone but keeps inserting themselves into every major cultural conversation. Someone who talks about being silenced while simultaneously having access to every major platform in the world. Each word was delivered with surgical precision, designed to cut deep. The temperature in the room seemed to rise 10 degrees. Markle's composure was hanging by a thread, and everyone in the theater could sense that something explosive was about to happen. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was barely controlled fury wrapped in silk. You have absolutely no idea what you're talking about, and the fact that you think you can sit there and psychoanalyze my motivations based on tabloid headlines and Twitter commentary shows exactly why we have the problems we have in media today. But Colbert wasn't backing down. If anything, he seemed emboldened by her obvious distress. I'm not psychoanalyzing anything. I'm looking at patterns. I'm looking at someone who has made victimhood into a career choice while simultaneously wielding enormous influence and privilege. The words hung in the air like a challenge, and everyone in the room knew that whatever came next would determine whether this interview could be salvaged or whether they were witnessing something unprecedented unfold in real time. The stage was set for an explosion that would make television history, and both participants seemed to understand that they had crossed a line from which there might be no return. Markle's eyes blazed with indignation as she processed Colbert's accusation about turning victimhood into a career. The audience held its collective breath, sensing they were witnessing something that would be replayed and analyzed for years to come. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a dangerous calm that was somehow more terrifying than shouting would have been. Victimhood as a career choice? That's your professional assessment of someone who has faced death threats, racist harassment, and coordinated media campaigns designed to destroy her reputation and endanger her family. Colbert, realizing he had struck a nerve, but seemingly unable to stop himself, doubled down with the relentless precision of a seasoned interviewer who smelled blood in the water. I'm not minimizing any threats you've received, but let's be honest about the timeline here. Every time your popularity dips, every time a project doesn't go as planned, suddenly there's a new crisis, a new revelation about how you've been wronged. It's become predictable. He gestured toward the camera, including the audience in his assessment. People are starting to notice the pattern. The accusation hit like a physical blow. Markle's composure, already hanging by a thread, began to unravel completely. Pattern? You want to talk about patterns? Let's talk about the pattern of male hosts who think they can weaponize their platforms to tear down women who refuse to play by their rules. Her voice rose sharply, and several audience members visibly flinched. You sit there in your comfortable chair, protected by your writers and your network, and you think you can psychoanalyze the survival strategies of someone who has been systematically targeted by some of the most powerful media institutions in the world. Colbert's expression shifted, his trademark smirk fading as he realized the interview had entered genuinely dangerous territory. But his competitive instincts, honed by years of political combat, wouldn't let him retreat. Survival strategies? Is that what we're calling it? Because from where I sit, It looks more like a very calculated public relations campaign designed to maintain relevance while avoiding any real accountability for the chaos that seems to follow you wherever you go. The words hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Markle's face went through a series of expressions: shock, hurt, and then something approaching fury. When she spoke again, her voice was barely above a whisper, but it carried the force of a scream. Chaos that follows me. You mean like the chaos of racist tabloid coverage that literally drove me to consider suicide? The chaos of coordinated harassment campaigns that forced my family into hiding? The chaos of supposed journalists who decided that destroying a woman's mental health was acceptable collateral damage for their ratings? The theater had gone completely silent. Even the camera operators seemed to have stopped breathing. Colbert, perhaps realizing he had pushed too far, attempted to regain control of the situation. Meghan, I think we're getting into territory. That dash. No. Stephen, we're getting into the territory you dragged us into. Markle interrupted, her voice gaining strength and venom with each word. You wanted to talk about accountability? Let's talk about your accountability. You've spent the last 10 minutes trying to gaslight me into believing that my experiences of harassment and abuse are somehow my own fault. That's not journalism. That's not comedy. That's cruelty disguised as entertainment. Colbert's jaw tightened, and his professional mask began to slip completely. I'm not trying to gaslight anyone. I'm trying to have an honest conversation about someone who has made a career out of playing victim while simultaneously wielding enormous power and influence. You can't have it both ways, Meghan. You can't claim to be powerless while simultaneously having the ability to command international media attention whenever you want it. The accusation was like throwing gasoline on a fire. Markle shot to her feet, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. Power? You think having people listen when you speak is the same as having power? You think being able to get media attention is the same as being able to control the narrative? She began pacing behind her chair like a caged animal. I have influence because I survived what they tried to do to me, not because I'm playing some elaborate game for sympathy. Colbert remained seated, but his posture had become rigid, defensive. But you have to admit that your entire brand is built on being the victim of institutional forces. Every interview, every project, every public appearance is filtered through this lens of how you've been wronged. At what point does it stop being about justice and start being about marketing? The question was the final straw. Markle's hands clenched into fists at her sides, and when she looked at Colbert, her expression was pure contempt. Marketing? You think I'm marketing my trauma? You think I'm commodifying my pain for your entertainment? Her voice rose to a near shout, and several audience members began shifting uncomfortably in their seats. You have no idea what it's like to have your entire existence reduced to a punchline, to have your mental health become a topic of international debate, to have your own family weaponized against you by people who see you as nothing more than content to be consumed. Colbert, now clearly regretting the path he had chosen but seemingly unable to find a way back, made one final attempt to assert control. I'm not trying to turn you into a punchline. I'm trying to understand how someone who claims to want privacy and peace keeps inserting themselves into public controversies. How someone who says they want to move on from royal life keeps talking about royal life. How someone who says they want to be left alone keeps courting the very media attention they claim to despise. Each word was like a hammer blow, and with each accusation, Markle's composure cracked a little more. Her face flushed with anger, and her voice, when she finally responded, was shaking with barely contained rage. You want to understand? Here's what you need to understand. Every time I speak, every time I try to set the record straight, every time I try to protect my family from lies and distortions, people like you twist it into evidence that I'm attention-seeking. It's a trap, Stephen. If I stay silent, the lies go unchallenged. If I speak up, I'm accused of being a publicity hound. There's no winning with people like you. The atmosphere in the theater had become electric with tension. Audience members were looking around at each other, unsure whether they should be watching or averting their eyes from what felt like a deeply personal breakdown happening in real time. Colbert, perhaps sensing that he had pushed his guest beyond the breaking point, attempted to de-escalate. Look, I think maybe we should what? Markle cut him off, her voice now carrying a dangerous edge. Should pretend that this conversation didn't happen? Should edit out the parts where you revealed exactly what you really think about me? Should go back to playing the game where I smile and pretend that everything is fine while you and your audience get to judge every aspect of my life and find it wanting? The confrontation had reached a crescendo that neither participant seemed prepared to handle. And as Markle stood there, trembling with rage and hurt, it became clear that whatever happened next would determine whether this interview would be remembered as a moment of truth or a complete disaster. For a moment that felt like an eternity, the theater was suspended in absolute silence. Then Markle's voice cut through the tension like a blade, cold and precise in a way that was somehow more devastating than her earlier outbursts. You know what, Stephen? You've just proven every single point I've ever made about the toxicity of this industry. You've demonstrated exactly why people like me have to be so careful about who we trust with our stories. She moved closer to his desk, her posture radiating controlled fury. You invited me here under the pretense of a normal interview, and instead you've spent the entire time trying to psychologically dissect me for your audience's entertainment. Colbert shifted uncomfortably in his chair, finally seeming to grasp the magnitude of what he had unleashed. Meghan, I think there's been a misunderstanding here. I was just trying to ask the tough questions tough questions. Markle's laugh was bitter and sharp. Those weren't tough questions, Stephen. Those were character assassinations disguised as journalism. You've spent the last 20 minutes trying to convince your audience that my trauma is somehow fabricated, that my pain is somehow calculated, that my survival is somehow a marketing strategy. Her voice began to rise again, but this time it carried the weight of absolute moral authority. You've done exactly what every other media figure does. You've taken a woman who has been systematically abused by the press and tried to make her complicit in her own destruction. The audience was completely transfixed, many of them appearing visibly uncomfortable with what they were witnessing. Some were pulling out their phones, clearly recognizing that they were watching something that would be talked about for years to come. Colbert, meanwhile, seemed to be struggling with how to respond to accusations that were cutting uncomfortably close to the truth. I never said your trauma was fabricated, he protested weakly. I was questioning the way that trauma has been weaponized, commodified, marketed. Markle's voice was now filled with contempt. Those are your words, Stephen, not mine. And the fact that you can't even own them now shows exactly the kind of person you really are. She began gathering her microphone pack, her movements sharp and deliberate. You hide behind your jokes and your clever wordplay, but when someone calls you out on the damage you cause, you suddenly become concerned about misunderstandings. Colbert made one last desperate attempt to salvage the situation. Look, I think we're both getting heated here. Maybe we should take a step back and dash. No, Stephen, we're not both getting heated. You orchestrated this entire ambush, and now that it's backfiring, you want to play the reasonable mediator. Markle's voice was now ice cold, and her words carried the finality of a judge pronouncing sentence. You spent months planning this interview, researching talking points designed to make me look unstable, unreliable, and attention-seeking. You thought you could break me down on national television and make it look like journalism. The accusation hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Colbert's face had gone pale, and for the first time in the entire interview, he seemed genuinely speechless. Several audience members were now openly staring at him, clearly processing the implications of what Markle had just revealed. That's not. I mean, we always prepare questions that. Colbert stammered, his usual eloquence completely abandoned. Save it. Markle cut him off with surgical precision. Your producers reached out to my team with specific talking points. They wanted to cover points about failed business ventures, about publicity seeking, about victimhood narratives. They told us this would be a platform for me to share my perspective, but what they really wanted was content for your comedy writers to dissect and ridicule. She unclipped her microphone and set it deliberately on his desk. You never intended this to be a fair interview. You intended it to be a public execution. The revelation sent shockwaves through the audience. Several people gasped audibly, and the energy in the room shifted dramatically. Colbert looked around desperately, as if seeking help from his production team, but found only stunned faces staring back at him. Meghan, please, I think you're mischaracterizing he began, but she was already moving toward the edge of the stage. I'm Not mischaracterizing anything, she said, turning back to face him one final time. I'm exposing it. You brought me here to humiliate me, to reduce me to a punchline for your monologue tomorrow night. But instead, you've revealed something much more important. You've shown your audience exactly what kind of person you really are when you think you can get away with it. Her words carried the weight of absolute conviction, and as she stood there, silhouetted against the stage lights, she seemed to transform from victim to prosecutor. You've shown them that behind all the clever political commentary and the righteous indignation about truth and justice, you're just another powerful man who gets his kicks from tearing down women who refuse to stay in their place. Colbert's face had gone from pale to red, and his hands were gripping the edge of his desk so tightly that his knuckles had turned white. That's completely unfair. I've always been supportive of women's rights, of speaking truth to power speaking truth to power. Markle's voice rose to a crescendo that filled every corner of the theater. You are the power, Stephen. You have a platform that reaches millions of people every night. You have the ability to shape public opinion, to influence political discourse, to make or break careers. And you've chosen to use that power to attack a woman who has already been through hell just for the crime of existing in spaces where people like you think she doesn't belong. The accusation was devastating in its accuracy, and even Colbert seemed to recognize that he had been completely outmaneuvered. His usual quick wit had deserted him entirely, leaving him looking like nothing more than a schoolyard bully who had been called out by his victim. You want to know what real power looks like? Markle continued, her voice now carrying the authority of someone who had found their strength in the midst of battle. Real power is walking away from people who think they can use you for their entertainment. Real power is refusing to participate in your own destruction. Real power is having the courage to say enough when someone tries to break you down for sport. She moved toward the exit, her head held high and her shoulders squared. But just before she reached the edge of the stage, she turned back one final time, her voice carrying clearly across the stunned theater. Enjoy your viral moment, Stephen. I'm sure it will make great television. But remember this, every time someone watches this interview, they'll see exactly who you really are when you think the cameras are protecting you. They'll see what happens when someone with real power decides to punch down instead of up. And they'll see what it looks like when someone refuses to be your victim. With that, Meghan Markle walked off the stage, leaving behind a theater full of stunned audience members and a host who looked like he had just been hit by a freight train. The cameras continued rolling, capturing every second of Colbert's speechless aftermath as the reality of what had just transpired began to sink in for everyone present. The interview was over, but the real story was just beginning.